Moon Called by Patricia Briggs, Chapter 1. I didn't realize he was a werewolf at first. My nose isn't at its best when surrounded by axle grease and burnt oil, and it's not like there are a lot of stray cat werewolves running around. So when someone made a polite noise near my feet to get my attention, I thought it was a customer. I was burrowed under the engine compartment of a Jetta, settling a rebuilt transmission into its new home. One of the drawbacks in running a one-woman garage was that I had to stop and start every time the phone rang or a customer stopped by. It made me grumpy, which isn't a good way to deal with customers. My faithful office boy and two rustler had gone off to college and I hadn't replaced them yet. It's hard to find someone who will do all the jobs I don't want to do. "Be with you in a sec," I said, trying to sound snappish. I do my best not to scare off customers if I can help it. Transmission jacks be damned, the only way to get a transmission into an old Jetta is with muscle. And sometimes being a female is useful in my line of work. My hands are smaller so I can get them in places a man can't. However, even weightlifting and karate can't make me as strong as a strong man. Usually leverage can compensate, but sometimes there's no substitute for muscle, and I had just barely enough to get the job done. Grunting with effort, I held the transmission where it belonged with my knees and one hand, and with the other I slipped the first bolt in and tightened it. I wasn't finished, but the transmission would hold where it was while I dealt with my customer. I took a deep breath and smiled once brightly for practice before I rolled out from under the car. I snagged a rag to wipe the oil off my hands and said, "Can I help you?" Before I got a good enough look at the boy to see he wasn't a customer, though he certainly looked as though someone ought to help him. The knees of his jeans were ripped out and stained with old blood and dirt, and over a dirty tee he wore a too small flannel shirt, inadequate clothing for November in eastern Washington. He looked gone, as though he'd been a while without food. My nose told me, even over the smell of gasoline, oil, and antifreeze permeating the garage, that it had been an equally long time since he had seen a shower. And under the dirt, sweat, and old fear was the distinctive scent of a werewolf. "I was wondering if you had some work I can do," he asked hesitantly. "Not a real job, ma'am, just a few hours of work." I could smell his anxiety before it was drowned out by the rush of adrenaline, where I didn't immediately refuse. His words sped up until they crashed into one another. "A job would be okay too, but I don't have a social security card, so it would have to be cash under the table. Most of the people who come around looking for cash work are illegals trying to tide themselves over between harvest and planting season." This boy was white-bread American except for the part about being a werewolf. With chestnut hair and brown eyes, he was tall enough to be 18. I suppose, but my instincts, which are pretty good, pinned his age closer to 15. His shoulders were wide but bony, and his hands were a little large, as if he still had some growing to do before he grew into the man he would be. "I'm strong," he said. "I don't know a lot about fixing cars, but I used to help my uncle keep his bug running." I believed he was strong, werewolves are, and as soon as I picked up the distinctive musk and mint scent, I had been a nervous urge to drive him out of my territory. However, not being a werewolf, I controlled my instincts. I'm not controlled by them. Then, too, the boy shivering slightly in the damp November weather roused other stronger instincts. It is my own private policy not to break the law. I drive the speed limit, keep my cars insured, pay a little more tax to the feds than I have to. I've given away a 20 or two to people who'd asked, but never hired someone who couldn't appear on my payroll. There was also the problem of his being a werewolf, and a new one at that if I was any judge. The young ones have less control over their wolves than others. He hadn't commented on how odd it was to see a woman mechanic. Sure, he'd probably been watching me for a while, long enough to get used to the idea, but still, he hadn't said anything. and that won him points, but not enough points for what I was about to do. He rubbed his hands together and blew on them to warm up his fingers, which were red with chill. "All right," I said slowly. It was not the wisest answer, but watching his slow shivers was the only one I could give. "We'll see how it works. There's a laundry room and a shower back through that door." I pointed to the door at the back of the shop. My last assistant left some of his old work coveralls. "You'll find them hanging on the hooks in the laundry room. If you want a shower and put those on, you can run the clothes you're wearing through the washer. There's a fridge and a laundry room with a ham sandwich and some pop. Eat, come back out when you're ready." Put a little force behind the eat, and I wasn't going to work with a hungry werewolf. Not even almost 2 weeks from full moon. Some people will tell you werewolves can only shape change under a full moon, but people also say there's no such thing as ghosts. He heard the command and stiffened, raising his eyes to meet mine. And after a moment, he mumbled a thank you and walked through the door, shutting it gently behind him. I let out the breath I'd been holding. I knew better than to give orders to a werewolf. It's the whole dominance reflex thing. Werewolves' instincts are inconvenient, and that's why they don't tend to live long. Those same instincts are the reason their wild brothers lost to civilization while the coyotes were thriving even in urban areas like Los Angeles. The coyotes are my brothers, and oh, I'm not a were-coyote, if there is even such a thing. I'm a walker. The term is derived from skinwalker, a witch of the Southwest Indian tribes who used the skin to turn into a coyote or some other animal and goes around causing disease and death. The white settlers incorrectly used the term for all the native shape changers, and the name stuck. We are hardly in a position to object. Even if we come out to the public like the lesser of the Fae did, there aren't enough of us to be worth the fuss. I didn't think the boy had known what I was, or he never would have been able to turn his back on me. Another predator to go through the door and shower and change. Wolves may have a very good sense of smell, but the garage was full of odd odors, and I doubted he'd ever smelled someone like me in his life. "You just hire a replacement for Dad?" I turned and watched Tony come in from outside through the open bay doors, where he'd evidently been lurking and watching the byplay between the boy and me. Tony was good at that. It was his job. His black hair was slicked back and tied in a short ponytail, and he was clean-shaven. His right ear, I noticed, was pierced 4 times and held 3 small hoops and a diamond stud. He'd added 2 since the last time I'd seen him, and in a hooded sweatshirt unzipped to display a thin tee that showed the results of all the hours he spent in the gym. He looked like a recruitment poster for one of those local Hispanic gangs. "We're negotiating," I said. "Just temporary so far. Are you working?" "Nope, they gave me the day off for good behavior." He was still focused on my new employee, though, because he said, "I've seen him around the past few days. He seems okay. Runaway, maybe?" Okay meant no drugs or violence, and last was reassuring. When I started working at the garage about 9 years ago, Tony had been running a little pawn shop around the corner. Since it had the nearest soft drink machine, I saw him fairly often. After a while, the pawn shop passed on to different hands. I didn't think much of it until I smelled him standing on a street corner with a sign that said, "We'll work for food." I smelled him because the hollowed-eyed kid holding the sign didn't look much like the low-key, cheerful, middle-aged man who would run the pawn shop. Startled, I greeted him by the name I know him by. The kid just looked at me like I was crazy, but the next morning Tony was waiting at my shop. That's when he told me what he did for a living. I hadn't even known a place the size of the Tri-Cities would have undercover cops. He started dropping by the shop every once in a while after that. At first he'd come in a new guise each time. The Tri-Cities aren't that big, and my garage is on the edge of an area that's about as close to Kenwick as comes to having a high crime district. So it was possible he just came by when he was assigned to the area. But I soon decided the real reason was he was But I soon decided the real reason that he was bothered. I recognized him. I couldn't hardly tell him, I just smelled him, could I? His mother was Italian and his father was Venezuelan. And the generic mix had given him features and skin tone that allowed him to pass as anything from Mexican to African American. And he could pass for 18 when he needed to. Though he must be several years older than me, 33 or so. He spoke Spanish fluently and could use a half a dozen different accents to flavor his English. All of those attributes had led him to the undercover work. But what really made him good was his body language. He could stride with the hip swaggering walk of common to the handsome young Hispanic males, or shuffle around with the nervous energy of a drug addict. And after a while he accepted that I could see through his disguises that fooled his boss, and he claimed his own mother, but by then we were friends. He continued to drop in for a cup of coffee or hot chocolate with a friendly chat when he was around. "You look very young and macho," I said. "Are the earrings a new look for KPD? Pasco police have 2 earrings, so Kenwicks must have 4? He grinned at me and made him look both older and more innocent. "Been working in Seattle for the past few months," he said. "I've got a new tattoo, too. Fortunately for me, it's somewhere my mother will never see it." Tony claimed to live in terror of his mother. I'd never met her before, but he smelled of happiness, not fear, when he talked of her. So I knew she couldn't be the harridan he described. What brings you to darken my door?" I asked. "I came to see if you'd look at the car for a friend of mine," he said. "V-Dub? Buick." My eyebrows climbed in surprise. "I'll take a look at it, but I'm not set up for American cars, and I don't have the computers." "He should take us somewhere where they know Buicks." "She's taken it to 3 different mechanics, replaced the oxygen sensor, spark plugs, and who knows what else. It's still not right. The last guy told her she needed a new engine, which he could do for twice what the car's worth. She doesn't have much money, but she needs the car. I won't charge her for looking if I can fix it. I'll tell her so." But I had a sudden thought, brought on by the edge of anger that I heard in his voice when he talked about her problems. "Is this your lady?" "She's not my lady," he protested convincingly. For the past 3 years, he'd had his eye on one of the police dispatchers, a widow with a slew of kids. He'd never done anything about it because he loved his job. And his job, he said wistfully, was not conducive to dating, marriage, and kids. "Tell her to bring it by, and she can leave it in for a day or 2. I'll see if Z will come by and take a look at it." Z, my former boss, had retired when he sold me the place, but he'd come around once in a while to keep his hands in. He knew more about cars and what made them run than a small team of Detroit engineers. "Thanks, Mercy. You're aces." He checked his watch. "I've got to go." I waved him off and then went back to the transmission. The car cooperated, as they seldom do, so it didn't take me long. By the time my new help emerged, clean and garbed, with an old pair of Tad's overalls, I was starting to put the rest of the car back together. Even the coveralls wouldn't be warm enough outside. But in the shop with my big space heater going, he should be all right. He was quick and efficient. He obviously spent a few hours under the hood of a car. He didn't stand around watching, but handed me parts before I asked. Playing the part of a tool monkey as though it was a custom role. Either he was naturally reticent or had learned how to keep his mouth shut because we worked together for a couple hours, mostly in silence. We finished the first car and started on another one before I decided to coax him into talking to me. "I'm Mercedes," I said, loosening an alternator bolt. "What do you want me to call you?" His eyes lit up for a minute. "Mercedes, the Volkswagen mechanic?" His face closed down quickly as he mumbled, "Sorry, I bet you heard that a lot." I grinned at him and handed him a bolt I'd taken out and started on the next. "Yep, but I work on Mercedes too. Anything German made. Porsche, Audi, BMW, and even the odd Opel or two. Mostly old stuff. Out of dealer warranty. Though I have computers for most of the newer ones when they come in." I turned my head away from him so I can get a better look at the stubborn second bolt. "You can call me Mercedes or Mercy, whichever you like." "What do you want me to call you?" "I don't like forcing people into a corner where they have to lie to you. If he was a runaway, he probably wouldn't give me a real name. But I needed something better to call him than boy or hey you if I was going to work with him. "Call me Mac," he said after a pause. The pause was a dead giveaway, and that wasn't his real name he usually went by. It would do for now. "Well then, Mac," I said, would you would you give the Jetta's owner a call and tell him his car is ready?" I nodded toward the first car that we had finished. "There's an invoice on the printer. His number is on the invoice along with the final cost of the transmission swap. When I get this belt replaced, I'll take you to lunch. Part of the wages." "Okay," he said, sounding a bit lost. He started for the door to the showers, but I stopped him. The laundry and shower were in the back of the shop, but the office was on the side of the garage, next to the parking lot customers used. "The office is straight through the gray door," I told him. "There's a cloth next to the phone. You can use it to hold the receiver so it doesn't get covered in grease." I drove home that night and fretted about Mac. I paid him for his work in cash and told him he's welcome back. He'd given me a faint smile, tucked the money into his back pocket, and left. I had let him go, knowing that he had nowhere to stay the night because I had no other good options. I'd have asked him home, but that would have been dangerous for both of us. As little as he seemed to use his nose, eventually he'd figure out what I was, and werewolves, even in human form, do have the strength they're credited with in the old movies. I'm in good shape, and I have a purple belt from the dojo just over the railroad track from my garage, but I'm no match for a werewolf. The boy was too young to have the kind of control he needed to keep from killing someone his beast would see as a competing predator in his territory. And then there was my neighbor. I live in Findlay, a rural area about 10 minutes away from my garage, which is an older industrial area of Kenwick. My home is a single wide trailer almost as old as I am that sits in the middle of a couple of fenced acres. There are a lot of small acreage properties in Findlay with trailers or manufactured homes but along the river. There are also mansions like the one my neighbor lives in. I turned into my drive with a crunch of gravel and stopped in the old diesel rabbit in front of my home. I noticed the cat carrier sitting on my porch as soon as I got out of the car. Medea gave me a plaintive yowl, but I picked up the note taped to the top of the carrier and read it before I let her out. "Mrs. Thompson," it said in heavy block letters, "please keep your feline off my property. If I see it again, I will eat it." The note was unsigned. I undid the latch and lifted the cat up and rubbed my face in her rabbit-like fur. "Did the mean old werewolf stick the poor kitty in the box and leave her?" I asked. She smelled like my neighbor, which told me Adam had spent some time with her on his lap before he brought her over here. Most cats don't like werewolves or walkers like me either. Medea likes everyone, poor old cat. even my grumpy neighbor, which is why she often ended up in the cat carrier on my porch. Adam Humpman, who shared my back fence line, was the alpha of the local werewolf pack. There was a werewolf pack in the Tri-Cities was something of an anomaly because packs usually settle in bigger places where they can hide better, or rarely in smaller places they can take over. But werewolves have a tendency to do well in the military and secret government agencies, whose names are all acronyms, and the nuclear power plant complex close to the Hanford site had a lot of alphabet agencies involved in it one way or the other. Why the alpha werewolf had chosen to buy land right next to me, I suspect had as much to do with the werewolf's urge to dominate those they see as lesser beings as it did with the superb riverfront view. He didn't like having my old single-wide bringing down the value of his sprawling adobe edifice. Though I sometimes pointed out to him my trailer was already here when he bought his property and built on it. He also took every opportunity to remind me that I was only here on his sufferance, a walker being no real match for a werewolf. In response to these complaints, I bowed my head, spoke respectfully to his face usually, and pulled the dilapidated old rabbit I kept his for parts out into my back field where it was clearly visible from Adam's bedroom window. I was almost certain he wouldn't eat my cat, but I'd leave her inside for the next week or so to give him the impression that I was cowed by his threat. The trick with werewolves is to never confront them straight on. Medea mewed, purred, and wagged her stub tail when I set her down and filled her food dish. She'd come to me as a stray, and I thought for a while that some abusive person had chopped her tail off. My vet said she was a Manx and was born that way. I gave her one last stroke and then went to my fridge to scrounge something for dinner. I've brought Mac home if I thought Adam would leave him be, I told her, but werewolves don't take to strangers very well. There's all sorts of protocols they insist upon when the new wolf comes into someone else's territory, and something tells me that Mac hasn't petitioned the pack. A werewolf won't freeze to death while sleeping outside, however bad the weather. He'll be all right for a little while. Still, I said, I got out some leftover spaghetti to nuke. If Mac's in trouble, Adam might help. It would be better to introduce the subject gently. When I knew what the boy's story was, I ate standing up and rinsed the dish before curling up on the couch and turning on the TV. Medea yowled and jumped on my lap before the first commercial. Mac didn't come in the next day. It was Saturday, and he might not know that I worked almost every Saturday if there were cars to fix. Maybe he'd moved on. I hoped Adam or one of the wolves hadn't found him before I had a chance to break the news of his presence more gently. The rules that allowed werewolves to live undetected among humankind for centuries tended to have fatal consequences for those who broke them. I worked until noon and then called to tell the nice young couple that their car was a lost cause. Replacing the engine in it would cost them more than the car was worth. Bad news calls were my least favorite job. When Tad, my old assistant, had been around, I made him do it. I hung up almost as depressed as the hapless owners of the shiny, decked-out, well-loved car, now destined for the boneyard. I scrubbed up and got as much of the gunk from underneath my nails as was going to come, and started on the never-ending paperwork that had also fallen to Tad. I was glad he'd gotten the scholarship that allowed him to head to the Ivy League college of his choice, but I really missed him. After 10 minutes, I decided there was nothing that couldn't be put off until Monday. Hopefully by then, I'd have an urgent repair. I had been able to put off paperwork until Tuesday. I changed into clean jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed my jacket, and headed to O'Leary's for lunch. After lunch, I did some dulcetory grocery shopping and bought a small turkey to share with Medea. My mother called on the cell I was getting into the car and tried to guilt me into driving up to Portland for Thanksgiving or Christmas. I weaseled my way out of both invitations. I had enough of the family gatherings in the 2 years I'd lived with her to last a lifetime. It's not that they are bad, just the opposite. Kurt, my stepfather, is a soft-spoken, no-nonsense sort of person that just the man to balance my mother. I later found out that he hadn't known about me until I showed up at his doorstep. And when I was 16, even so, he opened his house to me without question and treated me as if I were one of his own. My mother, Margie, is vivacious and cheerfully flaky. And it's not difficult at all envisioning her getting involved with a rodeo rider like my father, any more than it would be difficult imagining her running off to join a circus. Or that she is the president of her local PTA is far more surprising. I like my mother and stepfather, and even like all of my half-siblings who had greeted my sudden appearance in their lives with enthusiasm. They all live together in one of those close-knit families that television likes to pretend is normal, and I'm very happy to know people like that exist. I don't belong there. I visit twice a year or so, and they don't invade my home, and I make certain that it isn't a holiday. Most of my visits are very short. I love them, but I love them better at a distance. By the time I hung up, I felt guilty and blue. I drove home, put the turkey in the fridge to thaw, and fed the cat. While cleaning the fridge didn't help my mood, though. I'm not sure why I'd expected it to. I got back in the car and drove out to Hanford Reach. I don't go out to the Reach often. There are closer places to run, or if I feel like driving. The Blue Mountains aren't too far away, but sometimes my soul craves the arid, desolate space of the preserve, especially after I get through talking with my mother. I parked the car and walked for a while until I was reasonably certain there was no one around. Then I took off my clothes and put them in a small day pack and shifted. The werewolves can take as much as 15 minutes to shapeshift, and shifting is painful for them, which is something to keep in mind. Werewolves aren't the most friendly animals anyway, but if they just shifted, it's good policy to leave them alone for a while. Walker shifting, at least my shifting, because I don't know any other walkers, is quick and painless. One moment I'm a person and the next a coyote. Is pure magic. I just step in from one form into the next. I rub my nose against my foreleg to take away the last tingle of the change. It always takes a moment to adjust to moving on 4 feet instead of 2. I know because I looked up that coyotes have different eyesight than humans, but mine is pretty much the same in either form. My bearing picks up a little, and so does my sense of smell, though even in human form I've got better senses than most. I picked up the backpack, now stuffed with my clothes, and left it under a bush or bunch of scrub. Then I shed the ephemera of my human existence and ran into the desert. By the time I had chased 3 rabbits and teased a couple in a boat with a coast glimpse of my lovely first self on the shore of the river, I felt much better. I don't have to change with the moon, but if I go too long on 2 feet, I get restless and moody. Happily tired in human shape, and newly clothed, I got into my car and said my usual prayer as I turned the key. This time the diesel engine caught and purred. I never know from day to day if the rabbit will run. I drive it because it is cheap, not because it's a good car. There's a lot of truth in the adage that all cars named after animals are lemons. On Sunday I went to church. My church is so small that it shares its pastor with 3 other churches, and it's one of those non-denominational churches, so busy not condemning anyone that it has little power to attract a steady congregation. There are relatively few regulars, and we leave each other mostly alone, being in a unique position to understand what the world would be like without God and His churches to keep the worst of the evil at bay. and I'm a faithful attendee. It's not because of the werewolves. Werewolves can be dangerous if you get in their way, but they'll leave you alone if you're careful. They are no more evil than a grizzly bear or a great white shark. There are other things, though, things that hide in the dark that are much, much worse. And vampires are only the tip of the iceberg. They are very good at hiding their natures from the human population, but I'm not human. I know them when I meet them, and they know me too, so I go to church every week. That Sunday our pastor was sick, and the man who replaced him had chosen to give a sermon based on the scripture in Exodus 22, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." He extended the meaning to encompass the fae, and from him rose a miasma of fear and rage that I could sense from my seat. It was people like him who kept the rest of the preternatural community in hiding almost 2 decades after the lesser fae were forced into the public view. About 30 years ago, the Grey Lords, the powerful mages who rule the fae, began to be concerned about advances in science, particularly forensic science, and they foresaw that the time of hiding has come to an end. They decided to do damage control, to see that all the human realization of the world's magic was as gentle as possible. They awaited the proper opportunity, and when Harlan Kincaid, an elderly billionaire real estate magnate, was found dead near his roses with a pair of garden shears in his neck, suspicion fell upon his gardener, Kieran McBride, a quiet-spoken, pleasant-faced man who had worked for Kincaid, a prize-winning gardener himself, for a number of years. I saw bits of the trial, and as most Americans did, the sensational murder of one of the country's wealthiest men, who happened to be married to a beloved young actress, and ensured the highest ratings for the networks. For several weeks, the murder occupied the news channels. The world got to see Kincaid with tears flowing down her California tan cheeks as she described her reaction to finding her dead husband lying next to his favorite rose bush, which had been hacked to pieces. Her testimony was Oscar quality, but she was upstaged by what happened next. Kieran McBride was defended by an expensive team of lawyers who had, amid much publicity, agreed to work pro bono. They called Kieran McBride to the stand and skillfully baited the prosecuting attorney and asking McBride to hold the garden shears in his hand. He tried, but only an instant his hands began to smoke before dropping them. At his attorney's request, he showed the blistered palms to the jury. He couldn't have been the murderer, the lawyer told the judge, and the rest of the world, because Kieran was a fae, a garden sprite, and he couldn't hold cold iron, not even through thick leather gloves. In a dramatic moment, McBride dropped his glamour, the spell that kept him appearing human. He wasn't beautiful, just the opposite. But anyone who has seen a Sharpie puppy knows that there is great charisma in a certain kind of ugliness. One of the reasons McBride had been chosen by the Grey Lords was because garden sprites are gentlefolk and easy to look at. His sorrowful, overly large brown eyes made him the covers of the magazines for weeks opposite less than flattering pictures of Kincaid's wife, who was later convicted of her husband's death. And so the lesser fae, the weak and attractive, revealed themselves at the command of the Grey Lords. The great and terrible, the powerful and powerfully ugly, stayed hidden, awaiting the reaction of the world to the more palatable among them. Here, said the Grey Lords, spin doctors, who'd been McBride's lawyers. Here are the hidden people, the gentle brownie who taught kindergarten because she loved children, the young man, a Selkie, who risked his life to save the victims in a boating accident. At first, it looked as though the Grey Lord strategy would pay off for all of us, preternaturals, fae or not. There were New York and LA restaurants where the rich and famous could be waited on by wood sprites or Murians. Hollywood moguls who remade Peter Pan using a boy who could actually fly and a real pixie for Tinkerbell. The resulting film made box office records. But even at the beginning, there was trouble. A well-known televangelist seized upon the fear of the fae to increase his grip over the flock of their bank accounts. conservative legislators began making noise about a registration policy. The government agencies began quietly making lists of the Fae as though they could use, or who might be used against them, because throughout Europe and parts of Asia, the lesser Fae were forced out of hiding by the Grey Lords. When the Grey Lords told Z, my old boss, that he had come out 5 or 6 years ago, Z sold the garage to me and retired for a few months first. He'd see what happened to some of the Fae who tried to continue their lives as if nothing happened. It was all right for the Fae to be an entertainer or a tourist attraction, but the Brownie kindergarten teacher was quietly pensioned off, and no one wanted a Fae for a teacher, a mechanic, or a neighbor. Fae who lived in upscale suburbs had windows broken and rude graffiti painted on their homes. Those who lived in less law-abiding places were mugged and beaten. They couldn't defend themselves for fear of the Grey Lords. Whatever the humans did to them, the Grey Lords would do worse. The wave of violence prompted the creation of 4 large reservations for Fae. Z told that there were Fae in the government who saw the reservations as damage control and who used fair means of foul to convince the rest of the Congress. If a Fae agreed to live on a reservation, he was given a small house and a monthly stipend. Their children, like Z's son Tad, were given scholarships to good universities where they might become useful members of society. They could find jobs. The reservation sparked a lot of controversy on both sides. Personally, I thought the Grey Lords and the government might have paid more attention to the innumerable problems of the Native American reservations. But Z was convinced the reservations were only a first step in the Grey Lords' plans. I knew just enough about them to admit that he might be right, but I worried anyway. Whatever ills they created, the reservation system had lessened in growing problems between the human and Fae, at least in the U.S. People like the visiting pastor, though, were proof that prejudice and hatred were alive and well. Someone behind them muttered that he hoped Pastor Julio recovered before next week, and a round mumbled agreed cheered me a little. I've heard of people who've seen angels or felt their presence, and I don't know if it is God or one of his angels I sense, but there is welcoming presence in most churches. As the pastor continued with his fear-driven speech, I could feel that spirit's growing sadness. The pastor shook my hand as I left the building. I'm not Fae, broad as that term is. My magic comes from North America, not Europe, and I have no glamour or need of it to allow me to blend with the human population. Even so, this man would have hated me if he had known what I was. I smiled at him, thanked him for his service, and wished him well. Love thy enemies, it says in the scriptures. My foster mother always added, at the very least, you will be polite to them.